So, welcome to everybody. And I mean, it can be good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Well, literally, people from all over the world attending this little webinar. Just to set some background, with the mental toughness concept, we now have well over 6,000 people who have completed the licensed user training program, and most use the concept and the measure to some degree. And that growth is accelerating. Roughly at around 1,000 people a year currently are joining the group. All of them are people who um, complete the licensed user training and they have a basic understanding of the mental toughness concept. What we've begun to realize is there is a need to provide some additional support and engage more fully with this community, because we're beginning to see the kind of questions we get asked. We do get asked lots of questions from practitioners from all over the world, and we realise that sometimes they're asking us questions that they really should be able to answer themselves. So it's our job to make sure that people around the world are better equipped to be able to deal with the situations they're faced. So this is the first in a series of CPD programs. It'll probably be continuous. It will run forever because we're continually learning new things. So this is about improving and developing mastery in the mental toughness concept. Now, I'm Doug Straharczyk. I think most of you will know that. I think I know most of you. And my colleague, Dr. John Perry, who's assistant professor at the University of Limerick, will be running this session with me. So the purpose of this session and the scope of the session and future sessions is that the mental toughness concept I suppose in the 4Cs format was launched just about 20 years ago. That's very short in the lifespan of a psychological concept. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've been able to move the concept on from what was a 6-factor model to the current 8-factor model. There's been a huge growth in research and development around the world and a huge interest from universities and researchers all over the world, which are beginning to add a lot of knowledge and understanding to the concepts and particularly its applications. And so what we need to do is to be able to share that with people. And sometimes we need to process it because it is sometimes just pure research, but almost all of it has some sort of implication. But it's important for us. I mean, everybody who works with us knows that we are almost obsessive about our connection with academia. And that's because what we want to be able to be is to be totally confident about the concepts that we present. So we want to be as sure as possible that the concept is sound. So for us, true evidence-based practice is vital. It's at the core of our work. But also, we do engage with practitioners. And when I talk about the 8-factor model and the original 6-factor model, that growth actually emerged because of our connection with practitioners. In other words, those additional factors really came from questions that practitioners were asking us. And so you, as practitioners, are all vitally important to us. And so what we want to be able to do is also be able to respond to practitioners. And practitioners seem to want to know more and more, and they seem to want to understand more and more. And so this is part of the process of building engagement with the practitioner community. So what we want to do in these sessions is to share what we know and learn, to grow understanding of the potential for applications for the mental toughness concept. And that's significant because it is a fundamentally important concept, and it literally applies to everything that practitioners come across. It's important in individual development, in team development, and in organizational development. And usefully, because it applies to all of those, it helps to join up some thinking between those areas in some very valuable and useful ways. And then mental toughness is a concept, it's an aspect of personality, And what we want to be able to do is to also show how it connects to other reliable concepts. And the key there is reliable. We will touch upon things that are probably more faddist in the conception. But ultimately, we want to be able to listen to practitioners, to your needs, and to your questions. We're going to launch into this session. It should take maybe about 35 minutes. We want to leave enough time for you to be able to ask questions at the end. But if you've got questions that arise as we go along, please put them into the chat facility. We have with us a colleague, Tony Molyneux, who is monitoring the chat facility. And when we finish our discourse, she will bring those questions into the discussion. If you're absolutely desperate to ask a question, please use the hands up emoji and we will stop and deal with it. Okay, so let's start with the fundamentals. In fact, this first session is really about the fundamentals of mental toughness. Most of you will be familiar with this, but it doesn't harm to just quickly run through it all. The first thing is that mental toughness is a narrow personality trait. What it does is describe our mental responses when something happens to us or around us. Most of the time when we talk about personality, we tend to be talking about behavioral responses. But actually, mental toughness is normally the response that comes before behavior, and it significantly influences behavior, and through that, our well-being and performance. In its current format, it consists of 8 factors, which are grouped around the 4 elements. People are familiar with the 4 C's: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. Each of the 8 factors is a scale which describes mental toughness at one end and mental sensitivity at the other. It's important to understand that we're not talking about mental toughness as a strength and mental sensitivity as a weakness. That's one of the things we've learned to really understand in the last few years. We're not talking about labeling people. Mental toughness can bring advantage in many situations. It can also bring disadvantage. Mental sensitivity can be disadvantageous in many situations. But there are times when mental sensitivity can bring advantage. So it's really about understanding yourself. Now, John will talk a little bit about the scales and the fact that they're independent, but they're related to a common concept, which means that there's actually an awful lot of information within the concept and within the profiles that are generated through the mental toughness questionnaire. So each profile might provide a bit of information around a particular factor, but actually there's a lot of rich information when you begin to combine the factors. And the fact that they're independent is very significant here. And then finally, when we first started, there was a tendency to talk about mental toughness as it was always the desirable state, and there was be a drive to improve mental toughness. That's not the case. What we learn is that we don't always need to change. So I'm just going to hand over to John, who will pick up on this and the next couple of slides.
Great. Thanks for that, Doug, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Always say that. It reminds me of the Truman Show. If anyone knows that one, where he has a similar kind of saying in there. And just picking up on Doug's last point there about we always need to develop mental toughness. Look, like tons of research shows us that in general, there's a mental toughness advantage. Okay, so overall, different elements of mental toughness are positively associated with good stuff and negatively associated with bad stuff. But that doesn't mean that it is necessarily the case for every single person in every single situation. Certainly when you're dealing with teams. And also there's a recognition of the actual sort of existence of mental toughness as a personality trait. We know that it's fairly resistant to change. It does change, but it changes over time and with experience and through reflection of that experience. And when Doug mentioned some of the more fads, I'm always wary when he says, here's something that you need to get, and you have to all become this one homogenous group of people who are all the same. So I'm gonna assume that everybody has a reasonable working understanding of the four C's model. If there's anything that I kind of bypass, by all means, stick a question in the chat and we can come to that. So you'll have noticed that we've developed over the last few years from a six-factor model of the four C's to eight. And that essentially comes from practitioner feedback of identifying where conversations people were having around commitment and challenge actually seem to lead to different responses. So, for example, with challenge, we would often talk about things like stress appraisals, seeing opportunities rather than threats. But then coaches might feed back to us that some of the discussions they have with people might talk more about forward thinking and how I'm approaching things versus how I actually learn from those experiences. And then that led us to believe, well, can we test out something different there? So each of the factors that you can see in the model provides us with a normative response. Okay, so we're able to link it back to a huge sample of people that we have to see where people fit, and you get the STEN score 1 to 10 there. And individually, there's value in looking at those scores, but actually, where you can really understand someone's story is by understanding how those factors interact. So, an example I always give, because I work in elite sport a lot of the time. I always see these profiles that have high achievement orientation and fairly low emotional control and confidence in abilities. And that's because that high achievement orientation, the driver, is that feeling that you're never good enough. So it's the perfectionist, really. So they're always pushing themselves and striving for more because they don't believe what they've ever done is good enough. Whereas actually, I would almost rather them have a fairly balanced, have average achievement orientation and average confidence and abilities. I think is probably a healthier mindset. So we look for those combinations, and one of the things that we try and do with a slide later on called people complex, right? And people are very complicated, and this is why I'm always skeptical of simple models, because every psychological model that exists is a simplification of reality, because people are way more complicated than even the most complicated psychological models. So when you see really simple psychological models, people are A or B, that to me, that never reflects reality. So what we have here is actually over 40,000 potential combinations of the STEM scores. And that holy grail really is an understanding the individual, what they're trying to achieve, their context, and how their profile means that they're going to experience something different. So we're going to talk in a while about burnout, for example, and being able to understand how one person might burn out for completely different reasons, how another person might burn out, and we can predict that through the profiles. So you'll know about control, life control, emotional control, sense of can do, believing that you're kind of able to determine your own future, managing your emotions. Commitment is about that stickability. So achievement orientation, striving to make sure you finish the job. Goal orientation, which is around having a sense of purpose, a belief in why you're doing the job. So Doug said independent but related. You could be really high in achievement orientation, but not high in goal orientation. You'd probably be a good sort of shop floor worker if that was the case. You stick to your task and you're not really fussed about having a purpose to it. Somebody high in goal orientation, being given a task and being told to stick to it, even if they're quite good at sticking to it, probably isn't going to be enough. They might stick to it, but they'll probably resent it because they have that sense of wanting to know where they're going. And then challenge, risk orientation, living outside your comfort zone, pushing yourself, and learning orientation is it's easy sometimes, I think, to think of learning orientation just as a reflective concept. And it is certainly about learning from your experiences, which is that kind of looking back part. But also, if you kind of roll that forward, someone with a high learning orientation believes that they can learn from whatever experience they're going to have. So, how's that going to affect how you approach new situations or avoid them? Well, if the worst that can happen is I learn, I'm much more likely to be proactive in kind of putting myself out there. So learning orientation, although it might sound a little bit more reflective, it's still proactive. And then confidence, as we know, we define as confidence in abilities, which is not self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a prediction on whether I'm going to succeed at a specific task at a specific time, right? And that can change, that can go up and down based on so many external factors. Confidence in abilities we talk about here is that confidence that's internally generated. So you might never have done something before, but someone who's high in confidence and abilities would have a sense that they would be able to do it. My wife always rolls her eyes when I take on a new DIY task. It's like, sure, how hard can it be? Just because I've never done it before, I'm sure I can give it a good go. And then interpersonal confidence is about that kind of interactions with other people. If we just go on to the next one there, Doug, our three eddies. So we use this as an example of three different eddies. You can see their overall mental toughness, 6, 6, and 6. Okay. So does that mean that they're the same person? And again, this is where I value complexity in psychological models, because a unidimensional version of mental toughness there says person A, B, and C are all equally mentally tough. But you know what? We look at that profile and they're not even close to being equal. We've got the balanced Eddie in person A, who scores sort of moderate to moderately high throughout all of the factors. And then we've got B and C, which have these much more spiky profiles. And I always find these really interesting. And I'm starting to do a bit of research in terms of what the outcomes of that might be. But where you can see that if we look at the control aspects there, person B, low in life control and emotional control, person C is high in life control and emotional control. So let's think about how that might manifest. The person who's really controlling, person C, that Eddie is a get out there, make it happen. Yeah, it's stressful. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it. They look at person B and think, what are you waiting for? Like, come on, get on with it. If they're not particularly self-aware. So completely different experiences. And because of how they think and how they process their emotions, that leads to completely different behavioral observations as well. And you can kind of see that throughout the whole profile, whether it's taking risks or whether it's how much you learn from your experiences, how confident you actually are, whether how much of it's bravado. We see these all the time. And to me, that's the value in reading a profile. And if I'm reading a profile with someone, I tend to not talk about individual scores in isolation, but I'd be interested in looking at a combination between those scores. So we see someone in person C with high levels of life control, high levels of goal orientation. You think there's a real go-getter. But Do they really put themselves in those situations due to their risk orientation? Are they learning from those experiences? And do they really believe that they can achieve in them? And you could almost say the flip there for person B as well. So understanding the whole profile, understanding that person's story is really interesting. And and remember that anytime when you're relating research to practice, research is based on samples of individuals. So on average, that sample, if they're high in this, they're more likely to be high in something else. But not everything within that sample is the same. It's what in biology you call it an ergodic system. If you take some muscle tissue, every cell within that tissue is a replica of one another. So if something's the case on one, it's the case on others. When we do psychological research, what we find is that there's plenty of person B's and person C's in. That's why our graphs have error bars on them for those person B's and person C's. And we end up seeing quite a few of them in practice as well. And they're the really interesting ones. And I would always take their profile holistically rather than trying to nail down into just talking about factors one at a time. Doug, I'll go back to you.
Okay. So picking up on what John said, been talking about, here's an example. Some of you will be familiar with it because I am increasingly using this as a very good example of what that granularity that we've been able to achieve can produce. I do think it's worth noting here that the mental toughness concept, unlike things like behavior, which can be observed by others, it's invisible. It's in our head and it's not easily seen. Now, what does worry us from time to time is practitioners who then go away and try to assess these 8 factors without the support of the mental toughness questionnaire. That's been specifically designed to help practitioners to get a better understanding or a better fix on each of those 8 factors. And that is really important because if you don't get that right, you can end up producing the wrong solutions and ending up with a worse outcome. And there is some evidence for that now. And we'll be touching upon that in a minute. But this particular example is a real example. And it highlights several aspects of what John's been talking about. And it really illustrates the challenge for a practitioner. Here we have an individual who's a senior executive in one of the biggest companies in the world. He's got an overall mental toughness score of STEM 7. That's above average and is the kind of score that you might associate with somebody who's got to the top of his profession or top of an organization. And if you look at the detail, especially the yellow highlighted bits, which look at the 8 factors, you can see that life control, goal orientation, achievement orientation, risk orientation, confidence and abilities, all his scores are high. Even his interpersonal score, confidence score is high. So, that would be a description of somebody who gets to the top of an organization. And this guy had got to the top of his organization. He pretty much had an unbroken record of achievement, climbing through the corporate ladder. But then he was given a major project, and the major project didn't go as planned. And what we can see is that actually he's got a couple of areas of mental sensitivity in his profile. That's the first thing. I mean, in all of our work, what we find is very few people are totally mentally tough or totally mentally sensitive. Actually, more people than not have elements of mental toughness and mental sensitivity in their profile. So it's not really helpful to talk about overall mental toughness or overall mental sensitivity, this unidimensional aspect. This multidimensional aspect is where the richness sits and where we as practitioners can really do our work. Because in this particular case, as things began to go wrong for this individual, you can see his learning orientation score was very low. He wasn't able to reflect. He wasn't able to think about what had happened. and he began to get frustrated. Now, his emotional control score is low. So what happens when somebody with a low emotional control score gets frustrated? It begins to lose control of his emotions. And that had an impact on, for himself, he actually ended up clinically depressed, but had an impact on other people. And this is to illustrate how this mental sensitivity can then impact or connect with the mental toughness. This is what we mean about connection, in a way that the individual's mental toughness then caused an even bigger problem. Because this individual's default response, if you look at his life control score and achievement orientation score, is when things get difficult, I'm just going to make more effort. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to work harder. And that's what he did. He ended up working 14, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, but still got nowhere. And that fed back into his lack of emotional control, low level of emotional control. And so what would have normally been an advantage or a benefit or a solution for him turned out to add to the problem. And so when we talk about mental toughness, it isn't one thing. It's actually a complex mixture of a lot of factors. And they're invisible. Without the use of the questionnaire, I don't think we would have got to this level of understanding with the individual. The individual didn't accept the results to start with, like a lot of people who have got low levels of emotional control. They can't see that. But eventually, a good coach was able to get through to him that actually he could have managed some of the situation differently, and that would have benefited him. But that wouldn't have been possible without this level of understanding of what's going on in that individual's head. So, from a practitioner's perspective,
he seems passionate, didn't he, Doug?
Yes, well, when he first
was that right?
was confronted with his emotional
passionate.
Control, he said, well, I've got perfect emotional control. So he was asked, well, what happens when things go well? He said, oh, my life is all of the party. I come into the office, I throw sweets everywhere, I buy everybody cakes. What happens when things go wrong? Well, I'm like a bear with a sore head. Everybody knows to keep away from me. And the coach said, and that's your control of your emotions? Imagine what other people see. And bit by bit, he got through. He saw himself as passionate, and he thought that was an advantage. He didn't realize other people would see that passion differently.
Yeah, so I think that's sorry, I interrupted there, but I find that happens quite a lot, right? Because we all have sensitivities, insecurities, and a kind of defense rather than kind of recognizing them as sensitivities is to like just build them into your own narrative in a sort of positive way. So, having low emotional control and saying I'm a passionate person, it just helps to protect yourself because you build a narrative that makes that kind of horrible feeling a bit insecure, go away. Having low levels of learning orientation, like, I live for the moment. Again, you reframe it in a positive way. So one of the really effective things that good coaching can do is kind of just pick up where how are you seeing that sensitivity? And most of the time, people have kind of they've developed their own narrative around that sensitivity and sort of in someone that's quite mentally tough, reframed it in a way that they kind of see it in a more positive light, which is fine in some ways, but it also means they ignore it because they don't see it as a problem. Sorry, Doug, I jumped in there.
No, that's fine. It's all very, very useful. But I mean, what I'm hoping is that we're getting an understanding that we have a very important and valuable concept here, and we've got a very useful and detailed understanding of it. But it's only useful if we can accurately and reliably understand and assess each of those 8 factors. And that's why we developed the questionnaire, of course. the other thing, and which we'll be touching upon in future sessions, is that, yeah, we can look at an individual, but we can also look at a group of individuals. So our current three biggest projects are looking at senior leadership teams. So we assess the individuals, but we can also aggregate the scores for those individuals to get a picture of the mental toughness profile of the team. Again, that's very valuable. And we're valuable in a way that we're connecting the individual with the team. So I'm going to go back to John just to touch upon this aspect of dimensionality.
Yeah, thanks. And look, I work in academia. We love to think in abstract ways. So rather than putting down some bullet points, this was how I kind of think of it. Where I alluded to it earlier. I don't really like this oversimplification of unidimensional measures. Okay. I don't think it's too controversial to say that the diagnosis and treatment of depression worldwide is pitiful. Um, because what you would often see, for example, uh, a lot of general practitioners will use the Beck Depression Inventory. It's been around forever. It's okay as a research tool, but the Beck Depression Inventory, they might not get people to fill it out, but they'll ask them the questions and give them a score, and then normatively it'll tell them whether they meet the criteria in the DSM for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder, for example. But how do you treat depression? You can't treat depression by going, there's your one score. You are depressed or not. Here's some SSRI tablets. Good luck. Um, if you really want to know, you have to understand way more about that person. So when I talk about dimensionality, if you imagine that larger circle you can see on the screen, that's the thing that you want to understand. So that might be a whole person. That might be a person's well-being. That might be a person's performance in a certain context. And then I've just put 4 circles on there. In reality, we'd have more circles and they'd be different sizes and so on, and they'd overlap more. But they're the things that we're measuring. So that could measure concepts to understand the outcome that we're trying to get. We don't expect to explain everything about the person, not unless we have them sat down in a facility for 2 weeks doing every kind of assessment we can. So there's some unexplained variance, we call it there. And then each of the things that we do measure, do assess, they will explain some of the aspects of the thing we're trying to understand. And some of that will be unique to that concept. So if you look at the one on the far right, you'll see there's a certain amount there that is only covered by the circle on the far right. So that would be, let's say that was interpersonal confidence explaining someone's work performance. Then that section would be explained by just interpersonal confidence on its own. But then there would be a section to the left of that overlaps with another factor, which could be their confidence and abilities. And then it also overlaps with another factor, which could be their life control. So again, this is a simplified version, but that's kind of how I always picture when you're trying to understand the causes of some kind of, whether it's affective state, like how well someone's, how they feel, or a performance or an observable behavior. We need to think that we're measuring various things. Some of them will explain a bit of that on their own. They'll explain it a little bit more when they're in combination with something else. And actually, when you've got 2, 3, 4 things in combination, that's probably where you end up explaining a lot more of how this thing comes about. And it's quite a scientific approach because we're trying to establish cause and effect. But if you want to change behaviors and you want to change how people feel about situations, establishing the cause is the key to it. And that's what we're able to do. Once we know that this cause leads to that effect, we know what we need to change and we can develop from there.
I guess John been, has picked up on the fact that our book, the best-selling book about mental toughness, is actually entitled "Developing Mental Toughness," and that by implication it means that we should be improving our mental toughness. That's the way that most people read it. In fact, hopefully by now you're beginning to see that we're not really talking about developing mental toughness. We're talking about understanding mental toughness. And there is a difference. And it matters because we have to start off with that diagnosis, that's understanding the individual before we can do anything. And it's a matter for the individual to decide, should I change? Should I be different in some way? And if I make the effort, would it actually produce a result that's important to me? The key in all the work that we get involved in is getting people to understand their mental toughness first, and then using that as a platform to enable them to make a sensible decision about whether they should be developing things. And the reality is, we don't always need to develop our mental toughness. We come across a surprisingly large number of people who, once they understand themselves, say, well, okay, now I understand my areas of mental toughness and I can understand the advantage that brings. I can even understand those times when it brings disadvantage. And I've got areas of mental sensitivity. But on the whole, I'm quite comfortable with living my life the way I'm living it. I just want to be able to cope better with the times when my mental sensitivity or even my mental toughness creates a problem for me. And so there isn't an imperative to develop mental toughness. As John said right at the beginning, in general, there is an advantage in being more mentally tough. Most of the research shows a correlation with well-being and performance and so on. But very little of that research starts off with, do you understand your level of mental toughness? And when practitioners work, what we can begin to see is that sometimes creating understanding about an individual's mental toughness is perhaps sufficient, it's not the right word, but it's effective. And so it's self-awareness that matters. So we're beginning to see the message changing from become more mentally tough to understand your mental toughness and mental sensitivity profile. And as we saw from that little case study earlier, we've all got areas of mental sensitivity and we've all got areas of mental toughness. And as John said, our personality can be quite sticky, it can be hard to change some of that, and it sometimes can be more effective to learn how to cope with some of the aspects of ourselves, but only if we understand what they are. So that is beginning to be an increasingly common message in a lot of our work. We're not here to change you. We're here to help you understand who you are.
Yeah, and I think kind of linking that to some of the other things we've spoken about so far is understanding that people are complex. People kind of those profiles are complex. People can achieve similar things with very different profiles, and certainly working within elite sport, what's really interesting is people can have preconceived notions of what they would expect people to be or be really tough because they just see behaviors. And a bit like the swan gliding on top of the lake underneath. Some people some people are pedaling like mad to to give that appearance, and other people are genuinely gliding along at that portion of their life. Um, so we can't put people into kind of these boxes, certainly based on what we see. And when we talk about understanding mental toughness, it's okay to have mental sensitivities. You can still be fine and you can absolutely flourish and succeed with mental sensitivities. But I do think having awareness of them and being able to put a strategy in place is really important. And that's where kind of strategies and pragmatism take over. We'll give an example of there's quite a lot of research around mental toughness and burnout. So we know overall that people with higher sense of mental toughness, or people that score higher on mental toughness, are less likely to become burnt out. We know that from cross-sectional studies where it's all measured at one point, but also prospective studies where we measure mental toughness at the start of something and then we track people over a period of time. However, you can still burn out when you're mentally tough. And it depends where that mental toughness comes from. Think about those profiles again. Some people, like the example Doug gave from the high-ranking executive director, because of their overall profile, their solution was work harder. And when that didn't work, work harder. And when that didn't work, work even harder, which ultimately is inevitably going to lead to burnout. But equally, some people might burn out because if you're mentally sensitive, particularly mentally sensitive, you're more likely to become overwhelmed with a situation. And the solutions in terms of how you manage a sense of pre-burnout could be quite different based on a profile. For someone with some profiles where they're probably a bit higher on average, maybe taking a bit of time away to sort of recognize that the sky isn't going to collapse if you take a bit of time off will be a good thing. Think about people really high in control. It might actually be a good way to stop burnout is to take a bit of time off and see, actually, the place still exists, even though you disappeared for a little bit of time. But if you were mentally sensitive, and you were really low in control, then that time away might actually need more time to stew on your anxiety, which means when you get back, you're even more of an anxious ball than you were when you took time off as well. So understanding the nuance in the profile helps us to understand how people can, not just how people react to situations, but how can we employ strategies and solutions to help people before those problems arise. Have you anything to add on that one, Doug?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I suppose again, what we can get quite irate about the posts that you see on LinkedIn that say, "Here are 5 tips for relieving burnout," and all 5 tips are all about take time off, take time off. And you think, yeah, but if I was a mentally sensitive individual and it was anxiety that drove me to burnout, and I actually didn't actually work that hard. I was just so stressed. So taking time off isn't going to help. It might even make it worse. The solution for a mentally sensitive person might be go and talk to somebody, go and get a coach, go and get a mentor, get somebody to help you with your anxieties. You couldn't offer that to a mentally tough or most mentally tough individuals because they just want to get on with things. They don't want to talk to somebody about their issues. They're very confident and feel very much in control of themselves. So they don't need that sort of thing. So if you don't tailor the solution to the problem, you're not going to solve the problem. We've probably slightly overrun. I'm just going to touch upon one little piece of research. So we talk about research a lot, and there is a particular research paper that emerged in March this year that has significance for the mental toughness concept. It came from Oxford University, which made people sit up and pay attention. If it had come from the University of the South Bank or something like that, people might not have given it so much attention. But it's an interesting paper because it looked at 143 well-being and resilience programs in 143 organizations in the UK and looked at their effectiveness, looked at the content and looked at their effectiveness. And it actually concluded quite dramatically that not one of those programs produced the results that were expected. And in fact, some of those programs made the situation worse. Now, those 143 programs included things like coaching, resilience apps, and mindfulness training. So the first thought is, does this mean that none of this works? Well, actually, that's not what they were saying. What they were saying is the 143 that we looked at don't work, and they were able to understand why they didn't work. Now, what they found was that the programs were individualized, but not customized. But that they mean, so if I was working with John and I said to John, I think you're showing signs, some signs of stress here. I found a course for you to attend that should help. It's the 5 secrets of living a more contented life. I've individualized it. I've recognized that John's got a problem or an issue, and I've done something about it. But what I've not done is customized. What I've not done is said, well, let's examine, John, exactly what's going on, and let's make sure that the solution that we're offering is actually going to do something about your specific situation. And so, from the mental toughness perspective, that's exactly what the mental toughness concept and the measure can bring to those kind of programs. I mean, as you know, we have a lot of practitioners who very successfully run programs that start with a mental toughness assessment. And the purpose of that is to customize whatever happens to the individual. And that matters not only for the person, but it should matter for the practitioner. Because, there's no point offering a mindfulness program if that's not going to work for the person that you're facing. So the other thing that they found was, is connected with this, that one size fits all simply didn't work. But an awful lot of practitioners, training companies still offer these one size fits all approaches. And then the other thing that they found was, in a lot of instances, people were being sent on a program. And they might be sent for the very best of reasons, but the implication could often be, it's you that is the problem. Go and fix it. But actually, it might be the sender or the sender's organization or the circumstance in which the individual is operating. And if you don't attend to that, all you do is send somebody to learn how to do something better, put them back in the same situation, and they don't have a chance to apply it. And so what they're bringing out is the need to connect context with the individual. And again, that's beginning to become a feature of a lot of the mental toughness work that's carried out. As I mentioned, we've got 3 major programs at the moment, and that's exactly what's happening. The individuals are being assessed, and the organization is also looking at itself using the mental toughness concept to understand something about itself, to be able to say, well, okay, we're going to try and help the individual in some way, but what do we need to do to be able to make sure that that individual has the best chance of improving well-being or improving performance? Research matters in an awful lot of ways because you've got to be able to find a reliable way of advancing. We're going to finish with John. We've probably overrun slightly.
Yeah. We might just kind of move on to onto questions, I think. So just the purpose of this slide, never standing still, is just to kind of give you a sense of just some of the research that's taken place, understanding overall profiles as predictors, the jangle effect of PhD student minds. Got a great paper on that. So the jangle effect in psychology, sometimes people use different words for the same underlying construct. So we got a big sample and tested that. How people can keep going, basically, so does mental toughness predict their actual like behavioral, observable behaviors, essentially. Some good stuff on innovation, curiosity, some control trials on various intervention programs as well. Those kind of things all ongoing at the moment, which I'm sure happy to tell people more about if they if they're interested in those. And that's just a selection, to be honest. They're just the ones that I'm sort of principal investigator for right now. There's loads of others going on around the world as well. So should we move on and take any questions? I don't know. Looking at the chat there, we can pick up some in there. And then also, if anyone wants to kind of raise a hand, we can come to you and ask a question. I saw a question there from Malgazata. You actually asked a great question, database with research papers on there. I wonder if we could do a little more there as well, just to kind of update it with kind of stuff that's coming out. And then Chris asked the one about teaching professions. I was looking through some of the research there. There's loads and loads and loads of stuff on the kids, loads of research around pupils and adolescents, and then there's not an awful lot of peer-reviewed stuff about teachers. Teachers getting overlooked, hey, what are the odds? But we do have some data from projects actually that we've run. Which project was it, Doug, that we found there was a positive association between the mental toughness of the teachers with the mental toughness of their pupils?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can mention the region, but yes, there is a big project, and it was an area of deprivation, and they got a lot of funding from the UK government to go and do something about it. Because one of the characteristics of the region was that I think it was about 4% of pupils in secondary school or high school went on to further and higher education. Well, generally in the UK, it's well above 50%. So this area was really suffering. There was just no hope and aspiration. So first of all, we were asked to go and assess the pupils. And we assessed thousands of pupils in the secondary schools. And what we found was that even compared to other areas, their mental toughness scores in general were lower than pupils in other parts of the country. So there was an issue there. And then we went and assessed, I can't remember now, probably 1,000 to 2,000 of the teachers. And we found that their mental toughness profiles were lower than the average. They were actually lower than the global norm. So the global norm is 5.5. You could walk anywhere in the UK, test 100 people, and you'd expect the average score to come out at 5.5. Their scores were coming out at nowhere near 5.5. So what we were able to do is see that there was a link between the mental toughness of the students and the pupils and the mental toughness of the teachers. Now, there's a number of factors there, and it's one of the reasons they didn't particularly like these results, because it indicated there was actually a bigger, more fundamental problem than they budgeted for. So weren't happy with that. But there were things like better teachers would tend to avoid this area. They would go to other areas. So there was the issue of, is this area only attracting teachers that wouldn't get a job anywhere else? There was an issue of whether the teachers were simply giving up. They were getting worn down by the work they were doing in the area, and so on. So, but we were able to see that there was a link, because we were able to see from school to school between the mental toughness profile of teachers and the mental toughness profile of students. And there is one study, and it was carried out in Northern Ireland, looking at special educational needs teachers, SENCOs, and they found that there was a correlation between, I can't remember what exactly it found, but there's a correlation between mental toughness and the performance of SENCOs.
And just to add to think, so of course we're not suggesting that correlation is causation, right?
No.
So that in that area, in that deprived area of England, it's not necessarily that the teachers were the cause of the lower mental toughness or vice versa. But the applied issue there is, we do know from research that people who have higher levels of mental toughness use less of their mental and emotional resource in managing stress. So teaching is a really stressful occupation. Um, if you're using up all of your mental and emotional resource, just managing the stress, when someone else comes to you with a problem, you've none left. You can't, you can't deal with that. Whereas if you're able to manage stress with using less of your mental and emotional resource, you've got more left. So when someone else needs that, you're able to offer it. So that you've got a double-edged sword in something like a deprived area with schooling, because it's a lot of people kind of want to move to easier areas, but it's also the job is more stressful than it is working in an affluent area, which means even if you've got pretty good mental toughness, you've got plenty of resource there, it takes a lot out of you. So you've got to kind of have really, really high levels of mental toughness to work in those if you're going to have enough resource left over to support people.
Wanda has asked a question which kind of is tangential to that. She's asking, be interesting to have a look at chefs and their mental toughness. And so again, that's an occupation that has its own set of stressors.
That's it. Yeah, it would be really interesting because it's one of those organizations or one of those industries that I think sometimes has a little bit of uh, uh, sometimes a false reflection of what it's like, because television chefs, I'm sure, are not representative of normal chefs. A bit like when you watch Dragon's Den and you think, but most owners of big companies I know are really nice people. They're not like people that are on Dragon's Den, but look, I suppose that makes good television. Also, a lot of inspiring entrepreneurs are really capable people, which isn't representative of The Apprentice either, is it? So, yeah, that would be really interesting. Are there any other questions that are on there that I've not seen?
We've got Adrian who's raised his hand, so perhaps we can let Adrian unmute and ask his question.
Go for it.
I think I'm
Adrian.
unmuted now, Doug. John, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah, nice to see you, Doug. Nice to see you, John. You okay? Yeah. A couple of questions really, based on what you said earlier about understanding self versus not necessarily developing mental toughness. My first question will be, I know you offer a 360. Can the MTQ Plus be done in a 360 format?
I would say not, because 360 is about observing other people's behavior, and you can't see inside somebody's head. So it's actually really difficult to sit and look at you, Adrian, and say, you come to me and say, look, I'm struggling a bit. If you look at those 8 factors, it could be any one of those 8 factors. And how can I observe which one of those 8 factors are? I can only observe behavior, and behavior is as an outcome of a combination of those 8 factors.
Would that apply to all
360s can do?
Would that apply to all 360s then, do you think?
No,
because some of them are, all of them are just, do you observe, Joe
yeah,
Bloggs
but
doing this?
If the items are carefully constructed, they are about a behavior.
Yeah.
So if you ask a careful question about a behavior, does Adrian smile a lot? Then you can assess that. Yeah, but
that would have been interesting during lockdown when we all had masks on, wouldn't it? Yeah. My second question is similarly
perfectly well with behaviour.
Yeah. Second question is similarly to understanding, which is with some psychometric tests, for the assessor, there are indications of things like social desirability and self-deception. In other words, is the individual kidding themselves, and are they answering the questions in a manner which they think they should be answering as opposed to truthful? Are there any chances of introducing measures such as those into the MTQ? The reason I ask is I've done a few people, some of whom I know reasonably well, and I think they've lied on it, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I'll let John come back.
Yeah, look, it is possible. I suppose it depends on how it's being used. So, what might be common in research is you might include, say, four um, social desirability items within a questionnaire. So there'll be things like, um, if I say I'll always do something if I say I do. I never tell a lie. I smile at everyone I meet. You know, those kind of things.
I've never broken the law.
Yeah. So if you're so you might then have a factor where if somebody scores above a certain amount, you deem it to be likely to be socially desirable answers, i.e., they're giving the responses that reflect how they want to be seen rather than what are truthful. It's it can be a challenge when you're doing it in practice because it adds another layer to the sort of the production of of documents. It's workable. Yeah, it depends whether you think it's of value in practice, really, because we can add it in research and that's no problem. I suppose if you're going to sit down with someone and talk through their profile, I'd maybe just suggest that you can address whether you think, or ask them if they think they've given honest answers, and have that kind of lovely awkwardness that we like to create. I had one with it was a golfer.
But they're likely to lie in answer to that question, John, then, aren't they? Yeah, of course I've been honest.
Yeah.
They might be.
It can be self-feeding, yeah.
I suppose it depends how much time you have with someone. I remember I was working with this golfer a couple of years ago, and I ended up saying to him, like, why are you trying to impress me? Like, that's impressing me isn't going to help you shoot a lower score on a golf course. Because I felt he was not being honest with it, but I don't know that if I would have presented him with, well, here's the scores you gave on what questions that were included for social desirability. I don't know if that would have really changed the impact of what I was trying to do, because I think he'd say, no, I do smile at everyone. I've never broken the law, you know, those kind of things. While he's talking on his phone and driving or something.
I could add a little bit here. Years ago, I had the privilege through Peter Clough of doing a bit of work with Dave Bartram, who is kind of a guru in the world of psychometrics. And he told me that faking scales or social desirability scales didn't work in one sense, in that the more intelligent the person or the brighter the person, the more likely they were to see through the question and work out how they should be responding to the question. So there was kind of an issue there. But the other thing he discovered, and this might be relevant for you, Adrian, because you work in this world, is he found that the salespeople had a tendency to fake good, and it was seen as a positive asset.
Well, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So don't
but interestingly,
use faking scales, but
interestingly, some of the salespeople I've tested, Doug, they've scored far lower than I anticipated.
Well, so in terms of mental toughness,
if they were faking good, they were, yeah.
Well, that might be, believe it or not, the first iteration of the mental toughness questionnaire, the MTQ-48, took 4 years. I mean, just so many times we had to go and test and test and retest the items to the point where we were confident that they were assessing what they were supposed to be assessing, that whoever completed the questionnaire would be understanding the questions in the same way. So there's some requirements in a very good psychometric measure, and and we've continued with that. I mean, John has brought another level of integrity to the concept.
Yeah, the MTQ Plus was 7 years. 4 years is nothing.
Geraldine,
Thank you.
you have a question for us. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you. I delivered 3 sessions of feedback just yesterday, actually. I haven't quite recovered yet. I did them 3 back to back. It's 3 sisters, which is part of my license training. They were all very different. It was a very interesting experience. One of the girls came out as a 1 on confidence in ability. And she had low scores across the board, but she felt quite strongly that her report didn't really reflect who she was. And what I was wondering and explored with her is whether the very low level of confidence and ability, which she agreed with, was that clouding the way she answered questions to the other factors. And I just wondered whether you have any thoughts about that and whether that can happen.
Going back to this side, this sense of independent but related. Okay, so on any psychometric scale, not all of the items kind of make an equal contribution to an overall score. So some of the scales will be more narrow. So, for example, interpersonal confidence is kind of a more narrow scale. If you were to draw a diagram of all the factors, that one would overlap a bit, but not loads. Similar with risk orientation and goal orientation, actually. They're a little bit more independent. Confidence and abilities would probably overlap the most, in that it's a little bit broader. The way that it interacts with other items or other scales within the model will be greater. As an example, take achievement orientation. You know, the extent to which you'll keep going at something, keep persisting at something. Well, if you're low in confidence and abilities, you're probably not likely to perceive a successful outcome. So where's the logic in keeping going? So by raising the confidence and abilities there, you would probably see achievement orientation increase because you're raising the belief that there's more likely to be a successful outcome at the end, which makes it a hell of a lot easier to stick to something. For risk orientation, kind of putting yourself out there, going outside your comfort zone. Again, if you're likely to believe that you're going to be unsuccessful, there's no logic to it, and we'll just protect ourselves. So there is again, you can't really present it as in a diagrammatic way. It just has to live in the abstract thinking world. But confidence and abilities would bleed into quite a few of the others. Life control would be similar as well. It's a slightly broader one. And as I say, things like interpersonal confidence and goal orientation tend to be, they're not narrow, but they're relatively narrow compared to those ones. I know it's a sort of a complicated answer because we're starting to sort of deal with an abstraction of something that's already an abstraction. But hopefully it makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And what you were talking about earlier in terms of someone's narrative, I guess low levels of confidence and ability can be potentially a little bit pervasive. They might apply that to lots of things. The way they talk about themselves. So I kind of wondered whether it affected how she answered the question. But yeah, that's really helpful. Do you have any information about the different factors and which ones you think are broader and narrower? Is there any information that you can send about that?
Can I put anything? We could do. I'm sure we could put together some kind of like blog post on it. I'm jotting down a few notes here. Because I've been playing with a couple of data sets, sort of looking at this, but I'm trying to think how can I sort of present it in a way that's accessible to someone who isn't like a statistician, right? Because we try and do as much as we can and sort of want to be able to bridge that gap between research and practice, because so much of research is just inaccessible in the way that it's presented. So like the research behind that is basically it's they're called structural equation models. It's just a bunch of modeling with just loads of numbers and very long equations, which doesn't read well. No one wants to read that on LinkedIn. So I'm trying to sort of think, okay, how can I put that in a way that is interpretive but still has integrity, without sort of taking something that by definition is incredibly complex. And I don't want to sort of oversimplify it, that it doesn't really reflect what the data says. So I'm kind of toying with that. But I'll put like blog post on breadth of factors. While I'm kind of hogging the floor as well, I've made a note around kind of the database and informing people maybe a sort of like when new stuff is added. And there's also a couple of comments about working groups and being interested in that as well. So myself and Doug will have a chat. So we have an advisory board. So maybe it's an offshoot of that.
Exactly, John. I think that's perfect. And we welcome that. That's purpose. We want that engagement. Yeah. And thank you for that last question. We do ask for it. There's on the slide, what do you want to know about mental toughness? So great question. Might mean a bit of work for us, but it's a great question.
I'm happy to take any further questions, but I know we're over time. So
yeah.
By all means, don't feel rude if you think I need to go.
So we are planning, and we will be announcing some more sessions. And by all means, if you're, I've got some questions you, or in the next couple of days, you're thinking about what you've heard, and you think, well, I wouldn't mind knowing something about this, that, or the other. Do let us know. That we want this to be very relevant to what you're doing. Thank you from me, and
yeah, and a big thanks from me as well. As Doug says, by all means, send on any ideas. We'd love to hear from them. And also, one of the things that we would be able to do is kind of connect people a little bit. So you might be working with there might be some people saying, "Oh, I'm working with young people. I'm working with medical or health professionals. I'm working with executive." So we might be able to put people in touch with one another to aid some collaboration that way, or perhaps in sort of geographical terms or something like that as well. So, yeah, it's nice to try and connect like-minded people.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for your questions, and thank you for listening.